and welcome to the sixth in our series, in our Joke API tutorial series, which illustrates how the SuiteEngine API engine can work from within Business Central. If you remember, in our previous video, we just started the process of using mappings. In other words, how do we process the response that we get from the API to something within BC? So, for example, populating tables or updating tables. This one probably will be a shorter video, just showing a different example of mappings. The data that comes through this API call, it's actually retrieving categories, and the data is organized just a little different, and we'll see how to take care of that in the mappings. So from a standpoint of our objectives, again, we're just going to do another mapping example. And this time the data, instead of being in the form of records, in other words, multiple fields per record, that this one is essentially going to give us the category names in an array, and we'll learn how to map it. And along the way, we'll end up reviewing how to take an existing message data buffer from the API call to construct the mapping skeleton so that you have a starting place on essentially the mapping exercise. So let's go back to Business Central and do a little bit of review. We were working with this API call the last time. Essentially, this would retrieve jokes for the number that we specified at runtime and the category that we provided at runtime. Since we haven't interjected any custom code at all to our solution, that should occur a couple of videos from now, where we'll start adding our own joke tables and joke category tables. But just to illustrate what is possible, we use the item category table to essentially point us to what type of jokes that we wanted. So if we look at the item category table right now, we can see that this is the standard demo categories that essentially come with the Kronos solution in the Business Central demo. We changed this description for miscellaneous because we were asking for miscellaneous jokes in our example. And we changed this to match what the joke API required for the miscellaneous category. Essentially, we were able to load this record up in an API parameter using the user interface that comes with the API engine, and then it would use this value to make the API call. And just as a review, if we looked at messages here, we could open up a message, and in our URL down at the bottom, we can see that essentially we interjected this value from that item category record, and that was in an API parameter. So it was used essentially in our request variables to generate this query request based on variables provided at runtime. I'm going through that. This is going to be a mapping exercise for this video. But the whole idea here is that the data was coming from the item category table. And we have another API call here called joke categories. Well, essentially, it will just get the possible joke categories. It doesn't really need any runtime parameters because it's just kind of a fixed call. Just go get the categories. But if we went and started to look at the messages here, and we can just pick any one of these, we can see that we essentially have the data coming back. And if you remember, we could look at the data structure that gets processed to. which is called the data buffer. So in our data here, we can see that we get essentially the response object, and then it has some values at that level, but then we're essentially getting an array of values that represent the categories that are possible. So essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 possible categories that we could have done. These are like aliases that we could use. That will come in some future session to see how to handle this relationship between the two. But for right now, we just want to get this data in there. So I just wanted to kind of show an example of the two side by side. Essentially in the joke API, the data that we got back, you can see that it was delineated here by the beginning of a record, right? So each one of these starts a new joke. And this didn't have any value on its own, but it had fields that were part of its path that would tell us, okay, here's the category it's in, here's the type of joke, give us the actual joke text, some flags about whether this is an inappropriate joke for whatever reason, and also a joke ID. But the key here is that the start of this record didn't really have a value on its own, but underneath it, it had a bunch of fields. If you notice over here in our categories, essentially this would be the beginning of a record, but it also has a value. So we'll see how to handle that in our mappings. So one of the secrets of being able to map with our API engine is knowing the underlying data that you're getting. Look at our Business Central solution, go back to our browser. So essentially, this is the data buffer. And remember, the review objective was to be able to essentially create our API mapping for this function based on the data that we got. So here's our categories. We can press this button, and it will automatically create a skeleton back when we're looking at this get joke categories. Now, if we look at the mappings, they were empty prior to me hitting that button, essentially. And you can see we got this structure. So it pretty much collapses the data into more of a path. What is it that we need to map, right? So we know that for each new category we get here, we want it to add an item category, or in fact, we want it to change or update an item category. So here are the steps that we need to do. So the first thing, we need a starting place. And that's what we call essentially the root node. So we're saying start here. And we'll tell it that this represents a table, a data, and we'll give it our item category table. I think it's 5722 item category. And since this is the mark that we're dealing with this table, we really don't need a field at this point in time. So now if you remember, we get down to this level where we're actually going to get the array of values. So this is going to become a record node because it designates the beginning of a record. And it's the beginning of a record for the item category table. And because the data is actually at this level, we're going to map it to a field, which is essentially the key value, code. All right? So the value that's in this category, in the single instance array, is going to be mapped to the key of the item category table. We also want to fill out the description. Now, remember, this code is actually a code type, meaning that it's always going to go to uppercase. And some API calls are case sensitive, and the data that we're getting back from the category API is not always uppercase. It's upper and lowercase, actually. So we want to map this same value to a different field within the item category table. So essentially what we'll do is say, hey, we're going to create a new line. We'll make it sequence 25, just so this is what makes this line unique. We can say, yes, it's categories. But in our source type here, and this is kind of a special type, we're going to say that it is essentially the record node value. So in other words, we're a little bit lower than that. We've already kind of popped down the stack and started a record, but we wanted to use this previous value. So here we can do this, but what we really need to do is give it its full path. In other words, where is this value stored? And it would be stored here. We want it to be mapped to the item category table, but this time we're going to map it to the description field. And notice that our API engine recognizes that that's not a key. Okay, so I think we have this all mapped the correct way. We've specified this is where we want our mappings to start, that it represents table item category, that this is where each record starts, and that we're going to use the value that's associated with that to put in the key field, and then we're going to get that value again and put it in the description field. So that's the mappings. We now have one more thing to do on this function. So this function, remember over here, we have here, we have a response processing method. Right now, we're telling it, well, just don't do anything with the response. In our other one that we did in our last video, we needed to change this to multiple record type. So essentially, we're going to do that again and say, hey, this is a multiple record update. In other words, we don't know exactly what we're going to get, but whatever we get, we're either going to be inserting records into our table or finding the records based on the keys that we've specified and then updating them. So before we execute it, let's go take one more time, take a look at our item category table. So we can see that we have the default data again, but I'm just going to change this to other for the time being, just to have it be something different. When the API call comes in, it's going to be the abbreviation for miscellaneous, MISC, in upper and lower case. So the desired result that we want is that this value is going to change. And we're going to get in all the other categories that we were missing. I think there was an any category, a pun category, a Christmas category, a programming category, etc. So let's close this now. Okay, we're on this, and let's see if we did everything right. So if we do execute, let's just take a look at the message. We can see like all our timestamps. This is something that automatically gets added as a parameter every time. It's the credential record, so that if you need to do something special with credentials, you have that data available to you. And you can see that our response essentially has all the categories there in it. So this was successful. It didn't require any parameters at runtime. It's just a simple API that says, bring me back all my categories. Okay, so let's see if it's succeeded. If it did, we should be able to see some differences in our item category table. And there we go. You can see our any category with the lowercase version of it, where we essentially remapped it. So Christmas, There's dark. Here's miscellaneous, where we change the value back to MISC. Then we have programming, pun, and spooky. So our mapping exercise here was a success. There are very advanced mappings that you can do, especially when we start considering records within records, that we can also provide custom code at runtime. If, for example, the value that we're receiving isn't the value that we want to put in our table, that we needed to go through some logic before it gets there, or maybe even formatting, maybe a date conversion, and so on. There are ways that you have the ability to essentially massage the data that's coming in so that it's reformatted, or even has a bunch of logic behind it. It could be totally different than just a reformatting exercise. But you can also do those things through code, which is past the scope of this video, but we hope to get to in future instances. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It was just a slight variation of the mapping exercise. I thought it was worth showing kind of that difference in data as to how you would map a single value array versus fields within a record designator. And I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time.